Directors had said they would consider any higher price by another bidder. Before Perelman made his bid for Revlon in August 1985, the single instance of a Drexel-backed deal that had started hostile and gone to completion was Coastal Corporation's takeover of American Natural Resources Company, ANR, which had turned friendly after 2 weeks' bitter struggle in April 1985. And ANR, an Oklahoma pipeline manufacturing company, was not Revlon. As one Pantry Pride strategist recalled, the attitude on the street was, "How could a major institution like Revlon be taken over by someone like this? A complete unknown. Someone who'd made his wealth in cigars and licorice, not to mention with his wife's money?" Dennis Levine, the Drexel investment banker who represented Pantry Pride in the Revlon battle, recalled Martin Lipton's attitude when the FI-GHT was just about to begin, in mid-August. Levine was in Lipton's office at Wachtell, Lipton on another matter. Lipton had just been retained to represent Revlon, and Levine had mentioned that he would be advising Pantry Pride. "Don't waste your time," Marty said. "Pantry Pride will never get Revlon." Lipton brought more than the usual defense lawyer's fervor to this deal. Over the course of the preceding year, Lipton, who had built his firm and his wealth on a takeover practice, had emerged as one of the most outspoken and vehement enemies of what he called the two-tiered, bust-up junk bond takeover. Two-tiered referred to the fact that bids had featured a front end which paid cash to tendering shareholders and a back end which paid debt securities, thus pressuring shareholders to tender speedily so as not to be left in the second group. But now that Milken appeared able to raise almost any sum of money through the sale of junk bonds, Drexel had moved to the all-cash bid, which would be much harder to defeat in court. Bust up referred to the plan, in most of these deals, to pay down the debt by selling off pieces, if not the entirety, of the company. During the course of the Revlon battle, Lipton would be moved to new heights, firing off to his corporate clients a memo entitled, "Rape and Pillage in the Corporate Takeover Jungle." This year has witnessed the demise of the few remaining restraints on corporate raiders. They have been let loose to take over and bust up American corporations at will. Lipton was drawing a line between the kinds of hostile takeovers he had helped to engineer in the 70s and the Drexel-type wave launched by what he called takeover entrepreneurs. He drew this distinction in testimony before Congress in the spring of 1985, when about 30 bills to curb hostile takeovers or junk bonds or both were being debated. Soundly financed acquisitions by successful operating companies seeking to diversify or expand have been an integral part of this country's economic development, and they should not be restricted, Lipton testified. But the bust-up takeovers by takeover entrepreneurs move assets into hands that Professor IT by reducing expenditures for research and development and capital improvements, while a very high percentage of the revenues produced by the acquired assets are diverted to paying the debt incurred by their acquisition. The result is enormous Professor ITs for the takeover entrepreneur in the short term, and badly weakened companies, both financially and operationally, in the longer term. What we face today, Lipton warned, is not different in substance from what happened in 1928 and 1929. Privately, Lipton expressed another concern, one shared by many of the businessmen and lawyers who were part of the Jewish establishment in New York, and by some of the Drexel contingent as well. They feared that the common strain among these nouveau entrepreneurs and their nouveau bankers at Drexel, an overwhelming majority were Jews, would unleash a backlash of virulent anti-Semitism. Lipton and other corporate defenders had already felt its undercurrent in the executive suites of the Fortune 500 corporations that had come under Milken's gun. Should the kind of economic disaster that Lipton and others were prophesying take place, they feared that Jews would be scapegoated. As one Drexel client who shared Lipton's concern put it, It used to be that the Jews would go into Manny Hanny, or Morgan Guarantee, and they'd beg for money, and they'd be rejected, while the Gentiles would come in and they'd all go to lunch and smoke cigars. Now it's a shift of power to the Jews. Drexel is making these huge sums of money, and the banks comparatively little. The problem is, all the entrepreneurs are Jews with the exception of Pickens and Lindner, a longtime supporter of Israel, is the most Jewish non-Jew I've ever known. Lipton had been practicing what he was preaching on the public podium. He had refused business from takeover raiders, including former client Sir James Goldsmith. More significantly, he had turned down Fred Joseph's repeated offers to split Drexel's legal work 3 ways. Among its longtime firm, Cahill, Gordon and Reindl, Skadden, Arps, and Wachtel, Lipton. In fact, Lipton had represented Drexel in one vital matter in the spring of 1984. But that was before Milken's takeover machine had really gotten into gear. Milken's only effort, at that point, had been Mesa Gulf. Lipton had been invited to speak on a panel at the 1984 Drexel High Yield Bond Conference. While he was there, Drexel executives learned of a planned coup d'état by their 35% shareholder. Groupe Bruxelles Lambert SAGBL was unhappy, among other things, about the fact that Drexel was reaping so many millions but paying no dividends on its stock. Lipton organized a defensive maneuver whereby the rest of Drexel shareholders voted to change the FI-RM's charter in such a way as to hamstring their Belgian partners. In the end, a compromise was reached. GBL got its desired dividend in return for lowering its holdings from 35% to 28.5%. They exchanged common shares for preferred. Since they did that, the value of the common had skyrocketed. That was the only time Lipton had agreed to represent Drexel. How Lipton had gone from hired gun, who with his friend and rival Joe Flom virtually had created the takeover business in the 70s, to crusader, even turning down business in the name of his cause, bemused many who knew him. Some questioned whether the impassioned polemic sprang at least in part from a shrewd business judgment, to curry greater favor with his beleaguered corporate defense clients and thereby enlarge his franchise, something which Goldman Sachs had done in the early 70s, when it announced it would not represent aggressors in a hostile deal. Or it may be that Lipton, like certain regents of the takeover world, felt proprietary about it, responsible for it, and abhorred the ways in which the newcomers, Drexel's parvenus, were changing it. Another outspoken and high-powered foe of the junk bond takeover by the spring of 1985 was Lazard's Felix Rahoton, who was now brought in to represent Revlon. Like Lipton, Rahoton had testified before Congress, and, like Lipton, he had sought to differentiate between those hostile takeovers which were fair and soundly financed, in which he as advisor, like Lipton, had made much of his money, and the current junk bond variety. The risk in financing these megadeals with junk paper is twofold, Rahoton had testified. First, the paper is not secure. In order to service the high rate of interest, companies have to either improve operating performance significantly or, what is much more often the case, make asset divestitures, which may not be desirable. Rahoton remarked, "It is an approach that also completely fails to take into account the fact that a large corporation is an entity with responsibilities to employees, customers and communities, which cannot always be torn apart like an erector set." The second risk, he had continued, lies in the illiquidity of the paper, since in most cases it is issued not as registered public securities but as a private placement, ultimately making its way through private transactions into financial institutions such as savings banks, insurance companies and pension funds. These institutions, many of them under considerable financial pressure, end up holding securities for which no large-scale liquid, public market exists. On the issue of fairness, Rohatyn had pointed to the market speculation that seemed to go hand in hand with these raids, as arbitrageurs often bid up the price of a stock before any public announcement of a bid, making it appear an insider's game. Public confidence idents in the capital markets, he had averred, is thus destroyed. He had pointed out that arbitrageurs manage enormous pools of money, some of them financed by junk bonds. Raiders also have huge pools, similarly financed. This creates a symbiotic set of relationships, with the appearance, if not the reality, of professional traders with inside information, in collaboration with raiders, deliberately driving companies to merge or liquidate. Also on the Revlon team, though not publicly committed to repelling the junk bond invaders, was Arthur Lehman, one of the best-known securities litigators in the country. His firm, Paul, Weiss, had a conference licit of interest, as it had been counsel to both Perelman and Revlon. Lehman decided that it would nonetheless be appropriate for him to work on the corporate defense for Revlon, one of the firm's largest clients for over 20 years, but not on its litigation. Lehman brought in Wachtell, Lipton to head the litigation. Capping the Revlon lineup was Simon Rifkind, a former federal judge and Lehman's senior partner. He was a crucial player. He was a very influential director on the Revlon board, and the Revlon lawyers were able to wave his mantle before the court. When Perelman made his hostile tender offer, Rifkind, distressed at having vouched for Perelman to Bergerac and encouraged their initial meeting, resigned from the McAndrews board and remained on Revlon's. A day or two before Perelman made his offer, he had asked to meet with Rifkind. The judge tried hard to dissuade him, said Lehman, who attended the meeting. He told him there were greener pastures elsewhere. He said that Ronald would never be perceived the same again after mounting a hostile raid. He said he wouldn't be following the path of Larry Tisch. But he didn't ask Ronald, for his sake, not to do it. As for Ronald, Lehman continues, he obviously cared a lot about what the judge thought of him. He wanted the benediction of Abraham. The only eminence gris that Perelman had in his Comer was Joe Flom, a senior partner of Skadden, Arps, who had expanded it from its core takeover business to become a full-service firm and a national powerhouse. Flom is a consummate strategist. Here he played his most significant role at the beginning and at the end. The day-to-day handling of the deal he turned over to Donald Drapkin, the then 37-year-old Skadden partner who had vaulted over many of his more senior colleagues to become Flom's protégé. He had become Perelman's close friend and lawyer 3 years earlier during Perelman's failed attempt to acquire Richardson. In line with the Drexel tenet that people work best when they have an ownership stake, Perelman had made Drapkin a principal in this deal. In June, '85, the board of Pantry Pride had loaned Drapkin money to buy Pantry Pride convertible debentures. For a lawyer to become a principal in a deal with a client was a first at Skadden and a practice not followed at any other major New York law firm. It enraged some of Drapkin's partners, but it was a measure of his new clout. From Drexel, Perelman's senior investment banker was Dennis Levine, a rising star in the firm's corporate finance department, recently arrived from Shearson Lehman Brothers. Since coming to Drexel, Levine had worked on Phillips, Coastal and Crown Zellerbach Corporation deals. Perelman also had his longtime sidekick, Donald Engel, who had first brought Perelman to Drexel. Engel had been a Drexel managing director until he resigned in 1984 to become a consultant, but he continued to be involved in Drexel deals and continued to be Milken's trusted aide for entertainment at the Predators' Ball. After his resignation, Engel moved his ICE into the top floor of the opulent townhouse owned by McAndrews and Forbes in which Perelman lived and worked, on East 63rd Street in Manhattan. Finally, and surprisingly, Perelman had on his team Eric Gleacher, head of mergers and acquisitions at Morgan Stanley, most white shoe of all Wall Street investment banking RMS. Gleacher had moved to Morgan from Lehman Brothers about a year earlier. He was familiar with Revlon from his days at Lehman, where Revlon was a client, and, according to Perelman, the idea of acquiring Revlon was brought to him by Gleacher in February 1985. Gleacher, moreover, is said to have mounted a vigorous campaign against heated opposition from partners in his firm for their representing pantry pride. He is said to have won only on the conditions that Morgan Stanley not be listed as dealer manager on the tender offer, which Drexel badly wanted them to do, so as to lend their credibility and also share the heat, and assume a distinctly secondary role to Drexel's, something Rohatyn refers to as Morgan's backstreet arrangement. Gleacher's partners may have looked askance at representing Perelman's pantry pride against a company as august as Revlon, but they had been increasingly tantalized, of late, by the fees in the junk market. In fact, since the fall of 1984, the venerable Morgan Stanley, along with many other investment banking RMS on the street, had been struggling to break Drexel's stranglehold on the junk market. By mid-1985, however, Morgan's record was an embarrassment. One of its inaugural junk underwritings, a $25 million issue for a Houston oil and natural gas company, Oxoco, a deal which Drexel had declined to underwrite, went into default after about 6 months. According to Forbes, the biggest loser on that deal was Morgan Stanley, which, when it couldn't sell the $25 million offering, took $18.20 million itself, and, after default, with the bonds worth about 35% of face value, suffered a loss of over $10 million. Drexel came to the rescue with one of its famed 3.9s. It was one thing to try to break into a market, however déclassé that market was. But it was quite another to join Drexel in one of its most daring assaults on the corporate establishment, and to assume a subordinate role. That Morgan Stanley would play handmaiden to this renegade firm was shocking to the rest of Wall Street and a measure of just how much of a force Drexel had become. William Loomis, a general partner at Lazard Frères, who worked on this deal with Rohatyn, said, "3 things made this deal a departure for Morgan Stanley. That they acted jointly with Drexel. That they acted secondarily to any other investment bank, let alone Drexel. And that they would go out and attempt to sell things that their client didn't own. That is really un-Morgan Stanley." Morgan Stanley was in charge of divestitures in this deal. And the divestitures, of course, were what made it all possible. Perelman's plan, at least at the start, was to do here what he had done on a much smaller scale in his earlier acquisitions, with Technicolor perhaps the best example. Acquire the company with virtually all debt and then sell off the pieces he didn't want, using the proceeds from their sales to pay down the debt and getting the remaining business virtually for free. Perelman made this plan explicit in his tender offer document, stating that Pantry Pride believed it might be able to realize up to $1.90 billion, the total of his offer, at the starting $47.50 per share price, from the sale of substantially all the assets of Revlon, excepting the beauty business. And it was, obviously, necessary to firm up these divestiture prices as much as possible, for Perelman, and, more to the point, Drexel, to know just how much they could afford to bid. One of Revlon's FIRST defensive moves was to try to shame Morgan Stanley out of the deal. Marty Lipton called them up and said, "How can you guys be getting in bed with Drexel?" claimed Dennis Levine. Bergerac called Robert Greenhill, a managing director of Morgan Stanley, with whom he had gone hunting on big game safaris. I said, "Bob, what are you doing with these clowns?" There was silence. And then I said, "I understand you are out getting prices for pieces of Revlon, selling a company you don't even own. You know, horse thieves used to be hanged. None of these calls to honor met with any success. The other defector from the corporate establishment, which Revlon executives and advisors also lobbied unavailingly, was Chemical Bank. It had made a commitment to provide approximately $500 million of what was then, at $47.50 a share, a $1.95 billion offer, on a well-secured, last-in, first-out basis. Unlike Citibank and Bankers Trust, which were known for their willingness to lend to hostile deals, Chemical had rarely done so, and never for a junk bond, bust-up rate. Also, its policy was to refuse to lend to a hostile acquirer of a client. Chemical had loaned to some Revlon companies in Europe. Rohatyn, who says he was amazed at Chemical's participation, called Michael Blumenthal, then chairman of the Burroughs Corporation and a director of Chemical, Bergerac called Walter Shipley, Chemical's chairman. Rohatyn recalled, a number of Chemical directors, Andy Sigler of Business Roundtable probably the most vociferous, were very unhappy about the policy issue. But once the chief executive of ICER had made a decision, it was difficult to override, and there would have been legal liabilities. But there was lots of turmoil. Revlon made some headway in persuading them to back out, added Andrew Brownstein, a partner at Wachtell Lipton who worked closely with Lipton on this deal, but the odds were long. Had the bank backed out, we believed it would have been a serious blow to them, Pantry Pride, FIRST, because Drexel charges more for the money they lend than the bank would, and, second, because it lent credibility for Drexel's investors, to be able to say that a bank was getting up 1/4 of the money. After threatening suit, and even sending to Bank of ICEL's a draft of the complaint, Revlon finally did sue Chemical, along with Pantry Pride and McAndrews and Forbes, in federal district court in Delaware, about 1 week after Perelman had announced his intention to launch a hostile tender at $47.50 per share, on August 19. Not named in the Revlon suit was Drexel, a decision Lipton made because of his prior representation of Drexel in its internecine battle with its Belgian shareholders in 1984. The Revlon suit marked one of the rare instances in a hostile deal in which a bank was joined as a defendant. Revlon charged FIRST that Chemical was a bidder for Revlon and had failed to make the disclosures required of one, and, second, that the bank was in violation of the margin rules set by the Federal Reserve which govern loans made on stock purchases. The claims of margin violation, made against both Chemical Bank and Pantry Pride, were potential showstoppers, said Michael Mitchell, a Skadden Arps partner who was one of the litigators on the Pantry Pride team. Essentially, Revlon was arguing that the loans made to Pantry Pride should be subject to the margin rules set by the Federal Reserve, because Pantry Pride's junk bond offerings and its chemical loan were all indirectly secured by Revlon stock. The maximum loan value of any margin stock is 50% of the current market value of that stock. And, Revlon was arguing, Pantry Pride's loans taken together, for $2.10 billion, far exceeded the maximum loan value of Revlon stock, with its current market value of $1.95 billion. The only other time in the junk bond wars that a target had raised this margin violation argument was in the Unocal battle against T. Boone Pickens, where it was raised not in the courts but with the Federal Reserve. Unocal and Pickens settled, however, before the Fed considered Unocal's petition. The rest of the Revlon lawsuit centered on alleged disclosure violations by Pantry Pride and attempted to strike at the inner workings of Milken's machine. Revlon charged that when Pantry Pride did its $750 million blind pool public offering in early July, Perelman and Drexel in fact had known that the money was in substantial part to be used for the Revlon bid but had not disclosed that in the offering prospectus. However, Revlon alleged, Drexel and Pantry Pride were not wholly chary with this information, disclosing to certain prospective bond buyers pro forma Revlon Pantry Pride financial statements, to convince them that the debt could be repaid. Moreover, Revlon charged that the prospectus failed to disclose that some $200 million of the $750 million that was raised was not for Pantry Pride's needs but for Drexel's, to enable it to sell off some of its junk bond inventory. Perelman testified that while he had been looking at Revlon, among other corporations, as a possible acquisition since as early as February or March 1985, he did not decide on it until about the second week in August. In an interview, Howard Gittes pointed to their interest in July in another acquisition, a Florida thrift, as evidence that they had not yet decided on Revlon. That thrift, however, would have cost only $50 million, hardly enough to warrant $750 million in the junk bond offering, and hardly a substitute for the Revlon acquisition. Indeed, Fred Sullivan said that, one, acquisition, had nothing to do with the other. The S&L was a money leverage deal, a way to get cheap capital. One Revlon source said that he was told by two top executives of two investment banking firms that the Revlon Pantry Pride pro formas had been shown to prospective junk bond buyers. But when the Wachtell, Lipton litigators took the depositions of more than 20 of these buyers, many of them loyal members of the inner circle, like Fred Carr, Nelson Peltz and Samuel Beltzberg, they found none who testified that he had been told that the target was Revlon. Rohatyn remains convinced that the Wachtell lawyers just got stonewalled, and that there was a disclosure violation. Perelman came to Bergerac in June and said he wanted to take over Revlon. He said he was about to go out and raise about $400 million. He went out and raised the $750 million and came back for the company. It doesn't take a genius to figure out what was happening. One whose deposition was not taken was Ralph Papito, the tough-talking chairman of Nortec, a mini-conglomerate based in Providence, Rhode Island. Papito, who describes himself as one of Drexel's top-level clients, said that Milken has raised $600 million for him since 1983, and that he, in turn, has invested in Drexel's megadeals. In GAF's bid for Union Carbide, for example, Papito said, he committed to buy $50 million of bonds, and had to make that decision in 24 hours. I call this a renaissance, Papito declared. In the old days of J.P. Morgan, it would have taken 4 months, at least, to raise that kind of money, and you would have had reams of paper. But it's really not that complicated. We do it with just a term sheet. We're all pretty savvy. And it's 100,000% trust. Knowing Mike, if he tells me something's good, I tend to believe in it. In June 1985, Drexel raised $300 million for Nortec, for acquisition or other corporate purposes. Papito said he had only planned to raise $150 million. But it was so easy. It was sold in 2 days. They forced us, he said with a laugh, to $200 million, then $250 million, then $300 million. They wanted us to go to $500 million, but I said no. It was a far cry from the early days, when Milken used to raise $25 million or $50 million for a company that wanted to expand and couldn't get that kind of bank financing. Now it was more a matter of Milken saying to his customers, "Here, want $300 million?" And they're replying, "Sure, why not?" While Papito did not know exactly what he would do with that money, Milken was not at a loss for ideas. In July, Papito bought $10 million of preferred stock in Pantry Pride's blind pool public offering. "You buy people in this business. Perelman's a pretty savvy guy," says Papito. And Pantry Pride had that big tax loss carry forward. Did he know the money was for Revlon? Orally, they tell you things, Papito replied. They say it's Revlon. They don't say in writing what they're going to do with the money, but orally. Revlon's claim that Pantry Pride and Drexel failed to disclose that at least $200 million of the $750 million offering was for Drexel's needs was an attempt to highlight the Drexel daisy chain. Drexel raises money for one client, such as Nortec, which then buys the Pantry Pride offering, and Pantry Pride then buys the securities of other clients, and so forth. If the issuer understands at the time of his offering that he will pay the piper by buying other junk bonds, this ought to be disclosed in the prospectus. To Revlon's allegation, Perelman's response was simply that after getting the money he had decided to invest some of the proceeds from the offering, about $350 million, in fact, in other Drexel underwritten junk bonds, in order to make up his carrying cost, of about 14.5%. According to JITIS, they had told many investment banking firms that they were in the market for junk bonds, but only Drexel had available the quantity that they wanted. We started hearing that others were trying to buy them from Drexel, to sell to us. JITIS also points out that they brought in an independent consultant to recommend to them which bonds to buy. That consultant was Mark Schenkman, one of Milken's FI-RST recruits into this market. Schenkman had recently left his job at First Investors and was about to start Schenkman Capital Management, in which one of Drexel's managing directors, the London-based Albert Fuss, would own 24%. Not surprisingly, Schenkman recommended Drexel bonds, original issues for other deals, he says, though he declines to name them. We talked to Merrill Lynch and Solomon, Schenkman said, but they didn't have the size. I told them we needed bonds in quantities of $10 million, $15 million, $20 million. They, Solomon, for example, wanted to sell us oil paper, debt issued by oil companies, and we didn't want that. Schenkman said Perelman and JITIS wanted new issues, as opposed to bonds in the secondary market, because the new issues would have greater liquidity. Pantry Pride bought 10 to 12 different issues, with interest rates close to that on Pantry Pride's bonds, in blocks of roughly $15 minus 20 million, bigger and therefore riskier than Schenkman recommended. These were sold when the Revlon deal went through. Pantry Pride had FI led with the SEC for only $350 million, back in June. But after Perelman and JITIS went on their roadshow, also in June, visiting 10 cities in as many days, there was much greater demand. Ronnie was in Paris, and Milken kept calling me and saying he could sell 400 FTY million dollars, then 500 FTY million, then 600 FTY million, JITIS recalled, echoing Papito. Finally, at 700 FTY million, we decided to stop. By 1985, it was increasingly more usual than not for Drexel clients to take down much more than what they initially FI led for, and, by deduction, much more than they had thought they needed. Schenkman asserted, Drexel, more than anybody else, always FI less for less than they think they're going to do. It's a trick of the trade. First, it shows the company how great they are. And, second, the buyers think the company must be in really great shape to have so many more orders. Schenkman added that, as a buyer, he does not like it when an issue doubles in size over its FI Ling FI Ger. Then there are no new buyers afterward, if you want to get out. And the fact that it can double doesn't mean that the deal is great, it's just because there is so much money burning holes in people's pockets. By mid-September, all of Revlon's claims in the federal litigation had failed, and the locus of significant court action in this battle would move to the Delaware state courts. Revlon's lawyers were unable to find any evidence that prospective bond buyers had been told the target was Revlon. Despite the fact that Pantry Pride in Discovery produced documents that showed they were analyzing the Revlon acquisition, code-named Nicole, for Donald Drapkin's 18-month-old, from at least April, and that in late June there was a memo on the Nicole deal that stated, purchase price, $47.50 per share. The district court judge found credible Pantry Pride's position that no decision had been made on Revlon until early August. On the alleged margin violations, the court essentially deferred to the Federal Reserve, which would in fact take some action some months later, when the Pantry Pride Revlon drama was history. Another allegation which Revlon made in its complaint, that Pantry Pride and Drexel had selectively tipped certain arbitrageurs before the offer became public, so as to move large amounts of the company's stock into the hands of those arbs, who would then warehouse it for them, was also never proven. In the last 5 trading days before the Pantry Pride offer, an average of 1,258,800 shares of Revlon common stock per day traded hands, as compared to 283,760 per day in the preceding 5 trading days. As Walk tells, Brownstein said, the whole shareholder base of the company had changed before anything had happened publicly. Revlon's advisors, however, never banked on the federal litigation to defeat Perelman. Nor did they view the poison pill, an anti-takeover device instituted just before Pantry Pride FI-RST announced its hostile tender, as more than a buyer of time. It was with their major corporate maneuver that they expected to stop Pantry Pride in its tracks. An offer to exchange 10 million common shares for a package of notes and preferred stock valued at $57.50, thus exchanging about 1/4 of the company's equity for debt. After the buyback was announced on August 26, Bergerac reportedly summoned a group of company executives into the large conference room opposite his office on the 39th floor of the General Motors building and, gesturing to a sword that hung on the wall, according to a member of the Pantry Pride team, declared jubilantly, "We have just cut off Perelman's balls and nailed them to the wall." This battle was laced with tales of such machismo. Perelman recalled that, just prior to Revlon's announcing the buyback, Rifkind had set up a meeting between him, Bergerac and Lehman in Rifkind's office. "They saw the meeting as my looking for a graceful way to exit. I saw it as their looking for a graceful way to go along. I'll never forget it. Bergerac looked at me and said, 'I am not afraid of this. I am a big game hunter. I sit there and a tiger charges me, and when it gets to 10 feet from me I shoot it between the eyes.' I said, 'Then you shouldn't be afraid of a tender offer.'" Bergerac was, indeed, confident that he would prevail, and his confidence sprang from his advisors. "They all were totally convinced that if we did the exchange, Perelman would be fine-ished," Bergerac said later. In addition to turning 1/4 of the company's equity into debt, the exchange offer contained covenants which, among other things, precluded most asset sales and the incurring of other indebtedness, which any Pantry Pride deal would require. These covenants, however, could be waived by the directors. The rest of the watching world seemed to agree with Bergerac and his optimistic advisors. 2 articles appeared in the business section of the New York Times 2 days after the exchange offer was announced. A victory by Revlon seen near, in which Revlon's buyback was likened to CBS's recent successful buyback, which had thwarted Ted Turner, and Pantry Pride chairman pursues elusive quest, in which Perelman was portrayed as tilting at windmills, an almost sure loser. According to one source, depression set in at Morgan Stanley. People were going around the firm saying this hostile tender was not the firm's idea, that Gleacher had given assurances at the start that it would be friendly. Eric was being put in a pretty unpleasant position. For nearly 2 weeks, Brownstein recalled, Perelman looked like he was dead in the water. All through the period of the exchange offer, he did nothing. Then, on September 16, 4 days after the conclusion of the exchange offer, Pantry Pride came back with a $42 bid, the equivalent of its $47.50 bid with the debt that Revlon's exchange offer had incurred factored in. This bid was not conditioned, as the FIRST offer had been, on the redemption or invalidation of the poison pill, but was conditioned on 90% of the stocks being tendered, so as to diminish the pill's impact. But the real point of this offer, qualify cations and all, was that Perelman was still coming. Perelman's initial offer, rather surprisingly, had stated that the $725 million from junk bonds would be raised in the public market. This set Revlon apart from most of the buyouts and the few hostels that Drexel had backed, where the debt was raised, or commitments were made, in a private placement. These had the advantage of speed. While a private placement can be completed within 20 days, public offerings take as long as 45 to 60 days to complete. And since public offerings have to be registered with the SEC, they can be held up even longer by regulators' objections. But Milken's private placement distribution system was heavily stocked at this point. Some speculated, too, that Milken wanted to show the world the scope of his powers, show that even in a hostile deal the public capital markets would lend themselves to his instrumentation. It would have been a feather in his cap to raise the money for a hostile deal in a public offering. It would have been a FIRST, declared Stuart Shapiro of Skadden, Arps. A few of the Pantry Pride lawyers, however, had been unhappy about the initial plan to raise the money publicly, believing it far too slow and unwieldy a process. Now, in Perelman's revised offer, Milken had switched from public to private placement. It seemed to signal that the deal would be done expeditiously. The Revlon advisors and directors now resigned themselves to the fact that the company would not remain independent. They began to consider either finding a white knight or liquidating the company, doing something similar to what Perelman wanted to do, but giving the premium to the shareholders instead of allowing it to fall to him. Meanwhile, in Pantry Pride's war room, Perelman's off ICE on the second floor of his McAndrews townhouse, an elaborate sitting room with several large pieces of sculpture and with a Modigliani and a Leger on the walls, there was anxiety. The team frequently repaired to Perelman's haunt, the famous Le Cirque restaurant 2 blocks away, which one participant referred to as our cafeteria. Don Engel tried to ease the tension, likening this contest to the color wars at Camp Wanaki, where he and Drapkin had been campers, and telling Perelman, the blue team will win. Perelman and Drapkin walked around the block, debating the merits of raising the bid. Perelman's new wife, Claudia Cohen, formerly a gossip columnist for the New York Post, was now a television entertainment reporter. Whatever else was happening, the group, led by Perelman, gathered in front of the TV set to watch her morning program. Perelman, who is about 5'5", would sometimes make Drexel investment banker Paul Abacassis take off his shoes and stand back to back with him, and then summon one of his executives and demand to be told who was the taller. As such pastimes suggest, the Pantry Pride team was feeling stymied. True, Perelman could afford to wait it out. He was not at risk of losing more than his fees and carrying costs. He had not purchased stock, in large part because of the Delaware State Supreme Court's decision in Unocal, which had validated that company's discriminatory offer to buy back stock from everyone but Pickens. But Perelman had conditioned his new tender offer upon 90% of the shares being tendered. And 90% seemed like a lot to expect. We spent days yelling at each other about what would happen, said one lawyer. Revlon could, of course, have played chicken and simply let Perelman try to get his 90%, but Revlon's advisors felt that the risk of his succeeding, and thereby getting the company at $42 a share, was too great. Or Perelman might raise enough money to take over just 51%, in which case the shareholders in the back end would be hurt. There were any number of disastrous scenarios. The problem with Revlon's finding a white knight, on the other hand, was that no company wanted to take the polyglot Revlon whole, and no one wanted the cosmetics business, which had been in the doldrums for a few years. Several days after Perelman made his $42 offer, a little-known private investment partnership that specializes in leveraged buyouts, Adler and Shakin, appeared as a buyer for the beauty business that no one other than Perelman wanted, at a price that ultimately reached a staggering $900 million. Adler and Shakin's entrance galvanized the situation. Now the leveraged buyout firm of Forstmann Little emerged as a buyer for the rest of Revlon. Peter Jacquith, with whom Bergerac had explored the possibility of a management buyout of Revlon a year earlier when Jacquith was at Lazard, had moved to Forstmann Little and was eager to revive the old plan. Within the next 10 days or so, a deal was hammered out in which Adler and Shakin, in a transaction that stood independent of the rest, would buy cosmetics. Forstmann Little, joined by Bergerac and other members of management, would then acquire the rest of Revlon for about $1.40 billion, giving the shareholders $56 a share, selling off a division to American Home Products and keeping the healthcare business. While this deal was being negotiated, however, Pantry Pride was neither oblivious nor idle. The Revlon directors were kept apprised of the negotiations, and, it seemed, so was Pantry Pride. Many of the participants on the Revlon Forstmann Little side were FIRMLY convinced that there was at least one channel from the board of directors to the other side. Wherever the leaks to Pantry Pride came from, they were constant and handicapping for Revlon. "I have never been in a deal where there were leaks like this," asserted Loomis of Lazard. "The transmission of information was immediate. And it reached the point where the people we were negotiating with didn't trust some of us, so they wanted to talk to some of us and not others, and felt they had to restrict their conversations generally." For example, when Forstmann Little finally made its bid at the October 3 board meeting, they didn't tell any of us they were at $6 a share until 1 hour before the meeting. Pantry Pride, meanwhile, cognizant of the deal that was in the works, was desperately trying to entice Bergerac. Don Engel enlisted Harold Janine, Bergerac's old boss at ITT, to pay Bergerac a visit. Janine, on behalf of Pantry Pride, offered to give Bergerac his parachute, as Perelman had offered before, to give him a second one, which he would be able to cash in 2 years, and then to sell him a division, one of the health divisions of his choice, at a favorable price, and finance it for him. "He didn't spell out favorable price, but these things are understood," said Bergerac. So the package they were offering came to close to $100 million. Bergerac's account of Janine's offer was conference IRMED by a Perelman advisor, though flatly denied by both Perelman and his lawyer, Drapkin. Bergerac's continued rejection of all financial enticement, however, was mystifying to Perelman and his advisors. One went so far as to call it irrational. "Some people think that for $100 million you have to be crazy not to accept," Bergerac acknowledged. "But I chose to fight these characters because I found them to be undesirable." After Janine's failed visit, Robert Greenhill of Morgan Stanley, the firm that was playing handmaiden to Drexel in this deal, tried the emissary role. "I remember Greenhill saying he could swing it, he'd go see Michel," scoffed one Perelman team member. "If anything, he made it worse." So in order to combat Forstmann Little, Pantry Pride had no choice but to give more money to the shareholders. On September 27 it raised its bid from $42 to $50, and then, on October 1, to $53. Stuart Shapiro of the Pantry Pride legal team remembered, We were all standing around that afternoon. We knew they were going to have the board meeting at 6 p.m. and we'd heard all these rumors. We'd heard Forstmann Little was coming in at 5 FTY too. So in an hour and a half we convinced each other we should go up another $3 to 5 FTY3. We drafted this letter, and since it was already 6 p.m. we needed somebody to bring it over. We decided that it should be Dennis Levine. It's hard to get into the Revlon building at night, and Dennis is so ingenious we figured he'd find a way. So we told him he was the messenger. He was mortified. We put him in a Rolls Royce to make him feel better. And he got it to them. Shapiro said that in August they had not believed that the company had these values. But since then they had learned that the divestitures could bring prices several $100 million in excess of what they had estimated. And they had seen Philip Morris Companies Inc. buy General Foods Corporation for nearly $5.80 billion, and Procter & Gamble pay $1.55 billion for Richardson Vicks, Inc., showing that established, big-name consumer products companies were worth much more than Wall Street analysts had thought just a few weeks earlier. From the start, some of Perelman's advisors thought he was overpaying at 47 FTY, Shapiro said. But Perelman's view was always that everyone else was being too conservative in their valuations, and that the assets were going to be worth much more. Told by Bergerac that a management buyout at a superior price was in the works, the board made no decision on Pantry Pride's $53 offer. 2 days later it met again and voted for the management buyout with Forstmann Little at $56 a share. Bergerac's parachute would be triggered, and he would invest it in the deal. Management would have 25% of the equity. There was no lock-up, an agreement which so favors one bidder that it makes the acquisition of the target by any other bidder uneconomic, given to guard against any other bidder, but there was a provision promising Forstmann Little a bust-up fee of $25 million if it was topped by another bidder. That was on Thursday, October 3. Finally, after close to 2 months of running the emotional gamut, Revlon's advisors breathed a sigh of relief. The Forstmann Little Adler and Shakin deal had been extremely complex, and those involved had doubted that they would succeed in putting it together with the speed that was required. But, in just 10 days, they had done it. And while the company would be broken up, they had, this time for sure, they believed, escaped the unsavory Perelman. The following Monday, Pantry Pride was back, with a $56.25 offer. And within 48 hours, by Wednesday, Drexel had obtained commitments for $350 million of the next $700 million and announced it was highly confident of obtaining the remaining $350 million. Perelman paid a little more than $5 million in commitment fees. On Wednesday, Arthur Lehman, who had always been more open to the idea of negotiating with Perelman than his two co-defenders, Lipton and Rohatyn, and who had, after all, attempted to broker the deal at its inception in June, instigated a meeting between Bergerac, Theodore Forstmann, and Perelman, in an attempt to work out a three-way solution. At around midnight on October 9, Perelman and his entourage arrived, for the FIRST time, in Revlon's gilded, Rococo foyer on the 39th floor of the General Motors building. "I'll never forget those 20 or 30 guys coming off the elevators," recalled Bergerac. "All short, bald, with big cigars. It was incredible. If Central Casting had had to produce 30 guys like that, they couldn't do it. They looked like they were in a grade D movie that took place in Mississippi or Louisiana, about guys fighting elections in a back room." "What a scene," Lehman concurred. "All the Drexels were in one room. These guys with their feet up on Michel's tables, spilling their cigar ashes onto his rugs." For their part, Perelman's group thought little of Bergerac's decor. The animal heads from his safaris mounted on the walls, the elephant leg stools, the Abercrombie and Fitch-type murals of lions and tigers, the antique commode, throne-like, in Bergerac's private bathroom. As Drapkin commented, it was the tackiest. The three parties met, in various groupings, until 4 a.m. At the end, there was a deal on the table in which Perelman would take over the company and then sell one of the healthcare companies to Forstmann Little at a price that Forstmann now set, which Perelman would later claim was far too low. But Theodore Forstmann made clear that he would do it only if it was what Bergerac, who would run this one company, wanted, and by the next morning Bergerac said it was not. What did emerge from the meeting, and what made the biggest impression on Perelman's adversaries, was this. Perelman declared that, since Forstmann had had access to the Revlon numbers and he had not, he would simply use Forstmann Little as a stalking horse. Whatever they bid he would raise by 25 cents. He had done so already when he went to $56.25. By that time, Lazard's Loomis asserted, Perelman had clearly changed his thesis, from seeing this as the deal of the century at 47 Phi FTY, where he would sell the rest and keep cosmetics for free, to saying, anything Forstmann Little can do, I can better by a quarter. It may no longer have been a phenomenal deal, but there were his fees to pay, the interest on the money he'd raised, his reputation for efficacy as an acquirer. I'm convinced that if Forstmann Little had been at Phi FTY 9, he'd have gone to 60. He had to do this deal. Indeed, Perelman's debt service and dividend obligations on the $750 million of securities he had issued came to roughly $110 million annually. The Pantry Pride offering prospectus had made the disclaimer, which Drexel subsequently made boilerplate, that funds generated by the existing operations will not be sufficient to enable the company to meet those obligations. Perelman had invested about half of the approximately $730 million he had received from that offering, after paying Drexel its fees, in other high-interest paying junk bonds, but those were, of course, risky themselves. He could take a loss on the principal. The interest on the majority of the securities Pantry Pride had issued was slightly more than 14%. So, assuming for the moment the bank rate, which was 8%, Perelman had a negative carrying charge of about $40 million a year. And it was, of course, not a case of just losing that $40 million. How was Perelman to pay back the $750 million, which even in the never-never land that Drexel had created must come due someday? If Perelman did not get Revlon, he had to get something else. Fast. And it had to be a good and reasonably priced acquisition, something that was increasingly hard to find. And if such an acquisition was hostile, then, after more months of fees and carrying costs, it too might not work. And Perelman would be no longer just a tilter at windmills, but a loser. There was also the time and money already invested in the Revlon deal. Perelman owed roughly $20 million in lawyers' and investment bankers' fees. And he had just incurred the commitment fees of over $5 million for the $350 million he had taken down in the private placement. Beyond these practical considerations that impelled Perelman, his advisors say, was his urgent desire to do the deal. Echoing other Perelman associates, Fred Sullivan referred to Perelman's incredible tenacity. He was like a dog with a bone. He would not stop. I think if he'd had to bid $90 he would have done it. Drexel's Abacassis added, I don't know when Ronnie would have stopped. We were getting nervous. It was getting very thin. On the Revlon Forstmann Little side, Loomis was not alone in his assessment of Perelman's position. In just a week, Loomis and others had gone from believing that they had buried Perelman to seeing him as someone whom no bid would stop. Bergerac said, we really were tempted to go to 60 or 60 FIV, just to watch him do himself in, but then what would we have done if by some chance he let us have it? Swept along in the maelstrom, the Revlon advisors and directors had gone from their initial and justifiable position of Phi Ghting Perelman's lowball bid of $47.50 to seeking a way to thwart his making an ever higher bid. The dynamics of the deal had changed, but their animus for Perelman stayed constant and blinded them. One other element had been added to the scenario in this last week. When the board approved the buyout with Forstmann, Revlon had had to undo all the defensive measures it had instituted to ward off pantry pride. It had redeemed the poison pill and waived the debt covenants, imposed in the exchange offer, to allow Forstmann to leverage the transaction by borrowing on Revlon's assets. Now the price of the exchange offer notes, which had been issued August 26 and were intended to trade at par, face value, plummeted in reaction to the announced leveraged buyout. The notes would no longer be as secure, since Revlon's capital structure would be laden with debt. According to an AFFI Davit Phi led by Rifkind, since our meeting of October 3, the notes had dropped to as low as $87, a decline of about $60 million below par. I was deluged with telephone calls from irate holders who had exchanged shares for 11.75% notes which they believed would be worth par, and who now saw a 13% erosion in the value of their notes. And on October 10 an article in the Wall Street Journal, entitled, "Some Revlon Investors Say Company's Moves Could Cost Them Millions of Dollars in Losses," stated that some angry bondholders were considering legal action. What Pantry Pride offered to do about the noteholders is not clear. Giddis wrote Revlon a letter on October 11 stating that Pantry Pride would pay the interest and the principal on the notes, in other words, nothing extra. But Drapkin Phi led an AFFI Davit in which he stated that he had told Lipton, in a phone conversation on October 10, that they were willing to satisfy Revlon's concern for the noteholders and that the issue should not block the deal. What was clear was what Forstmann Little was willing to do for the noteholders. It promised to exchange the old notes for new ones that would trade at par. It also agreed to raise its bid to $57.25, $1 higher than Perelman's. In exchange, it demanded a lock-up option, something that would in essence preclude a bid for Revlon by anyone else. If another acquirer obtained 40% of the stock, that would automatically trigger the right of Forstmann Little to buy two divisions, Vision Care and National Health Laboratories, for $525 million. That price, according to Lazard, was below fair market value. And in this new version of the Forstmann buyout, management would drop out as equity partners. Lipton and Lehman both advised Bergerac that, with the lock-up option given to Forstmann, he was placed in a position of intolerable conference lict. On October 12, after Drapkin had made repeated unsuccessful attempts to reach Revlon advisors by telephone the previous day in order to reopen negotiations, the Revlon board approved the new, revised Forstmann Little deal, with the essential lockups. These were essential not just to Forstmann Little, which wanted to halt the dance with the inexhaustible Perelman, but to the Revlon board and its advisors, who wanted the same thing. As the board minutes, which, in line with Lipton's regular policy, were taken in elaborate detail, say, the effect of the lock-up option, Mr. Lipton stated, was to deter a bid at a higher price than $57.25. At the decisive meeting, Forstmann addressed the board. He made it plain that he and the Revlon directors had united to defeat a common enemy, the worst sort of parvenu. Mr. Forstmann noted that before this transaction had begun he had never heard of Ronald Perelman, say the minutes. He stated that, Mr. Perelman had proposed to Mr. Forstmann that they chop up the company between them. Mr. Forstmann stated that in Mr. Perelman's proposals the word, employees, was never in his mouth. A director inquired of Mr. Forstmann what his ultimate point of dispute with Pantry Pride preventing an agreement was. Mr. Forstmann stated that basically the chemistry just wasn't right. He stated that he had not entered into this transaction in order to make a deal with Mr. Perelman. Mr. Forstmann stated that he was interested in the transaction not only for the professor IT he could make but for other reasons as well, and that the other reasons would be violated if he had entered into a deal with Pantry Pride. Within 2 weeks of Revlon's having granted Forstmann Little the lockups, they were undone by Justice Joseph Walsh of the Delaware Chancery Court. The disclosure and margin requirements, whose alleged violation was the subject of the earlier litigation, were federal laws. But the issue that the battle now hinged upon, whether the Revlon board had failed in its fiduciary duty to shareholders by granting the lockups, was a question of state law. The court found that the Revlon board had indeed failed in its fiduciary duty to shareholders, having breached the duty of loyalty. While it found the Revlon board's early defensive measures, the poison pill and the exchange offer, appropriate, it opined that once it became clear that there would be a breakup of the company, the director's role changed from one trying to thwart a hostile acquirer to an auctioneer attempting to secure the highest price for the pieces of the Revlon enterprise. At that point, the court was saying, the board should have been essentially blind, or indifferent, to the identity of the bidders. Instead, it acted out of favoritism, seeming to want Forstmann Little in the picture at all costs. The reason for this, the court decided, appeared to be the directors' concern over their personal liability to the noteholders, but their sole responsibility as directors was not to the noteholders but to the shareholders. And it was their self-interest, the court found, that led them to make the concessions to Forstmann Little that excluded Pantry Pride. The directors had not contented themselves with giving Forstmann Little the lockups, but had further maneuvered to, in effect, lock up the lockups. The court mentioned that Revlon, after the final board meeting, had transferred into escrow the assets of the two divisions which were part of the lock-up agreement, and that the court, in response to a protest from Pantry Pride, had issued an order prohibiting any further transfer of assets until the pending motion had been decided. In Joe Flom's view, that transfer of assets was their biggest mistake. It colored the whole proceeding. On Thursday, 2 days before the final Revlon board meeting which Forstmann had addressed, Justice Walsh had seen lawyers for Revlon and Pantry Pride in his chambers. The Pantry Pride lawyers were pressing for an expedited hearing on their motion for a preliminary injunction to stop the Revlon-Forstmann leveraged buyout, which the Revlon board had voted to accept, and the Revlon lawyers said there was no reason the hearing could not be held after the weekend, during the following week, since no action was planned. The Revlon board held its meeting on Saturday and granted the lockups. The following Monday, a bank holiday, Revlon and Forstmann Little managed to get the assets and the $25 million breakup fee transferred from manufacturers Hanover to Morgan Guaranty. When the outraged Pantry Pride lawyers appeared before the judge the next day, the judge, clearly angered, issued an order preventing any further transfer of assets. On November 1 the Delaware Supreme Court affirmed the lower court ruling, and the battle that had begun in August was finally over. The court commented, Forstmann was given every negotiating advantage that Pantry Pride had been denied: cooperation from management, access to financial data, and the exclusive opportunity to present merger proposals directly to the board of directors. Favoritism for a white knight to the total exclusion of a hostile bidder might be justifiable when the latter's offer adversely affects shareholder interests, but when bidders make relatively similar offers, or dissolution of the company becomes inevitable, the directors cannot fulfill their enhanced Unical duties, a reference to the court decision in Unical, where directors were given wide discretionary scope, by playing favorites with contending factions. The court also commented that after that initial June meeting between Perelman and Bergerac, all subsequent pantry pride overtures were rebuffed, perhaps in part based on Mr. Bergerac's strong personal antipathy to Mr. Perelman. That, of course, was the key, the overriding animus that Bergerac and the rest felt for Perelman and Panty Pride, and the Drexels. It was not simply that the Revlon directors and advisors feared that Pantry Pride would not take care of the noteholders and so had turned to Forstmann Little. It was that they feared, more than anything, that Perelman would come back, offering more and more, with his limitless piles of lucre, and there would be no escape. The conquest of Revlon signaled the end of an era. Those who defended it were struggling to perpetuate a way of corporate life, plush, congenial and secure, unmenaced by anyone but perhaps another corporate giant, that had lost its capacity to prevail in the economic world. The junk bond marauders had won here, and if they had won here they could win anywhere. It had all happened so quickly that Revlon's advisors, when they spoke later about the company, sounded faintly archaic, unmistakably out of step with the times. Milken had not single-handedly created a new age, but he had done more to shape it than any other individual. Months later Rifkind returned to the McAndrews and Forbes board, but he did not rejoin Revlon's newly constituted board. "I'd been a Revlon director since the Phi FTIES," Rifkind mused. "I had watched Revson build the company. The board was like a family. We'd known each other for years. It was collegial." Rifkind gazed out his off-ICE window toward the dome of St. Bartholomew's Church on Park Avenue. "If somebody could prove to you that the bricks of that cathedral could fetch a higher price in the market, would you dismantle it? I know, today it is put 'em together, break 'em up, no cement anywhere." In the final days and the aftermath of the battle, Bergerac was pilloried in the press and ridiculed by Perelman and his followers, who painted him as the kind of corporate executive from whom shareholders need deliverance. When Perelman was asked by a New York Times reporter about Bergerac's claim that he had offered to improve Bergerac's lifestyle, he responded, "I don't think that could ever be improved upon." With his enormous parachute and his elegant, European lifestyle, much of it supported by company perks, Bergerac had made an easy target. From the time the Forstmann Little management buyout was announced, he had received a working over in the press. At the outset of the battle he had announced that Revlon was worth $65 a share, and he had derided Perelman as a bust-up artist. Then he helped to engineer, with his roughly $35 million severance package, his own bust-up of the company, at a price that was $9 below what he had Phi RST said the company was worth. For this, Bergerac was portrayed as a self-interested hypocrite. But what this attack ignores is that $56 was a good price for the company, and that Bergerac had fought hard to bring it up from Perelman's $47.50, and then $42, when he factored in the cost of Revlon's exchange offer. He had done well for his shareholders. It is true that he was attempting to do the very thing he had accused Perelman of, busting up the company. But there was no white knight to take the company whole. Was Bergerac to do nothing and let Perelman bust it up for $53? In his own bust-up, he would have been able to take care of his people, something his advisors concur was a foremost concern throughout this battle. Had Bergerac been solely self-interested, he could have accepted Perelman's lavish inducements. Of his defeat Bergerac said, "It was a terrible experience. I would hope to never go through something like that again. At the final board meeting, people were bawling, I cried. You must understand, people had a love for this company. It was like a woman's being raped. Revlon was a public company. It did not belong to Bergerac or to the others on the board who wept for it. But shareholder ownership is an abstraction, compared to the tangible reality of a company, its directors, its employees who come to work every day, its customers and its community. It is the dislocation or destruction of that tangible reality that makes hostile takeovers so fraught with emotion. Felix Rohatyn contrasted Revlon, which he calls his virginal experience in defending against a bust-up, junk bond raid, with other hostile raids in which he has been a defender. People on the other side are usually a company interested in a product, in business strategy, and the emphasis is on how do you put two companies together and make them grow. Where do we go from here to make them bigger and better? Here the overriding issue was, what can we sell for how much, to be left with a small piece for nothing, or virtually nothing. On the other side was a group of people tearing at a carcass, a group of people interested in numbers on pieces of paper, and nothing having to do with people, customers, quality, is this good, bad, or indifferent. This world had changed. And it had not changed for the better. It was not simply a matter of the old members of the club not liking the style of these shrewd, dollars and cents driven parvenus, who had started their own club and were now running things, though that, certainly, was a part of it. It was also that these newcomers, in their desperation to break in, seemed to FL out not only social values, but the law. Revlon's defenders had alleged and then failed to prove violations of the law, but they remained convinced that it was true. As one participant declared, in the 70s, among the people I dealt with, there were some I liked and some I detested, but they were all bright, decent